first, I want to remind you that this is a debate that's on the record. I think that's actually more interesting, but just so that you know. And also, it's going to be an interactive session. And for those of you that have seen me moderating panels, I always like to bring in the audience just during the conversation, because otherwise there's a risk that you end up as the last one, just asking questions at the end. So please think about your questions or your comments throughout, because I will come back to you actually throughout the session. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome our speakers to the stage. We have MEP Sean Kelly, MEP, an Irish MEP, which of course is very important on the second day of the Irish presidency, representing the EPP, so please join me on stage. We have Vittoria Carrara, a policy officer at DG Santé, representing the European Commission. Please welcome me as well. Breeden Murphy, a member of the Committee of the Regions. Breeden, please join us. We have been practicing Irish names because, you know, you can easily go wrong, but I hope I'm getting it right this time. Then we have Rosa Castro, Public Affairs Director at Eurordis, and Shane Ryan, General Manager Takeda, Ireland. What we had in mind with this panel, because we have relatively limited time, so we really would like to bring you up to speed with the most relevant questions when it comes to the life sciences sector, and also take into account that the Irish presidency is very ambitious when it comes to their presidency priorities for the life sciences sector. We focus in the first part of the conversation more on the European outlook, including on the Biotech Act, and then in the second part we really would like to dig deeper on the Irish perspective, because Ireland, as the speakers will underline, has such a vibrant life science sector, and there's really interesting developments happening there. So again, focusing first on the European outlook, then zooming in on the Irish perspective, including the presidency perspective. So MEP Kelly, let me start with you, because you must receive a lot of questions these days about the ambitions of the Irish presidency. And of course, as a member of the ITRE committee, you have been working a long time already on these questions about the key barriers preventing Europe from translating world-class research, where Europe still is doing really well, into global leadership in life sciences. And there we see that the EU is increasingly in a difficult position, being almost squeezed between the US and China. And oftentimes it's said that the EU is not that good in translating the research into patient access. So your take on where do you see developments at EU level going, and do you think the EU is well positioned to take on this position?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I think you've summarized it pretty well. I mean, it's well known that Europe is probably world leading when it comes to research. We have the Horizon Europe program, and the funding for that is likely to be doubled in the next MFF. But then we do the research and we come up with the results, and that's the end of it. The production is never here in Europe. The manufacturing is not in Europe. It goes off to the United States or China, particularly United States, because companies find it easier if they start up here to scale up in the US. So we have recognized now, I think, particularly in this mandate, as a result of the Draghi report, that unless we wake up and cop on, Europe is going to become gradually de-industrialized. It's happening already in some industries, where China has gained a huge foothold, and of course also now with the change in policy in the US. But the good news is that I think we have woken up. There are quite a number of proposals and resolutions coming before Parliament that will help to address these difficulties, one of them being the Biotech Act. And I think if we get it right, which I think we will, because we have good people working on them, including my good friend Utas Beke and Andrikaitis as rapporteurs, and I think that we have an opportunity now which we cannot allow to miss. Because if we do, as I said, we mightn't recover. And just to give one simple example, clinical trials in Europe 10 years ago was 22% of global clinical trials. Now it's 12%. In China, 10 years ago, it was 5%. Now it's 18%. So you can see the way we have taken our eye off the ball. and now we're trying to recover. I think we have enough, certainly enough good scientists, good universities to continue to bolster our research capacity, but we need to invest more and encourage more and get rid of the roadblocks in terms of time it takes to come to market, etc. All those things have to be addressed. And also the cross-border barriers, because they're inhibiting the single market development. So we have identified the problems, we are now coming up with the results, and the sooner we can get it done, the better. And I'm delighted that the Irish presidency, this is one of the priorities for them. I know the Minister well, Jennifer Carroll-McNeill. She's very keen to make much progress, and if we do, we'll have done a great service to Europe, and we will help to put in place good regulation that will turn things around.
Well, thank you so much, MEP Kelly, for setting the scene. And you mentioned the Biotech Act. So, Victoria, let me turn to you, because you have been a member of the Commission's task force that have been drafting the Biotech Act. So, what gaps have you seen with the Biotech Act, and how is the Biotech Act going to address the issues that MEP Kelly mentioned?
Yes, thank you. So, first of all, we saw some of the issues that rightly were pointed out. And we really started, instead of top-down, bottom-up, we spoke to stakeholders, and really two things came up. One is speed and one is scope. So in terms of speed, having clinical trial approved faster, but also a more streamlined approach to those, just to indeed address the gap that we just mentioned with China rising in terms of commercial trial versus Europe, but also US, and also access to capital. We know that we have fragmented pockets of capital in Europe, and they are not so risk-prone as in US. We know that companies tend to go more public in US than in Europe. So really, when we look at the proposal and the provisions of the Biotech Act, we have a whole regulatory part that wants to cut the time for clinical trial, but also really relying more on the reporting member state, have more of a European approach, so that especially when you have multi-site clinical trial, multi-country clinical trials, which are huge for access, for example, for rare diseases, you have more coordination, more speed, without cutting corner, of course, because the evidence that you bring in the trial, they remain the same level of quality. Is the organizational aspect, is the efficiency that improves and gets better. And from the access to capital part, we have also a whole set of proposals that wants to really support the crowding of private investment with the support of the EIB, so that we have a de-risking with EU budget that is supported by crowding in private investment as well. And I think what is important is that we are starting with this even before the Biotech Act. We have a project with EIB that already aims to crowd in 10 billion between putting forward 1 billion of EU budget through InvestEU. And we have FastEU, which is a project where voluntarily clinical trial sponsors are already trying this timeline, which are faster to get job done. Just one final point. I think that it's important to really look at what exists on the ground. And when we look at not only at access to capital, but also at fine state-of-the-art infrastructure, we really see what are the excellency in Europe, because it's true that we have a lot of academia, but it's also true that we have a really pocket of excellence. Ireland is one of them, for example. NIBRD is one of the centers that we looked at for biomanufacturing. So really elevating and connecting this structure is what is important to get the job done fast and in a pragmatic manner.
Thanks, Vittoria. And Rosa, let me turn to you, because as someone representing the patient community, how do we ensure that competitiveness and patient access are being seen as part of the same equation? Because after all, if we don't have sufficient markets, patients will be the ones staying later in line. And also, again, compared to the US and China, Europe is going to lose out if we don't combine the two.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation to the event and also for the question. So on behalf of Europe's Rare Diseases Europe, which is an alliance representing over 1,000 organizations of patients with rare diseases, I think that is the question. Because if I mean, just in a few, not the broad statistics, but there are more than 30 million people calculated with a range living with rare diseases. Why? Because there are also a lot of undiagnosed people. So, like, but you see, they are rare, but if you put them together, it's quite a considerable amount of people. Now, of this, at more than 90%, it is estimated, more than 90% of rare diseases lack a treatment option. So going back to your question, I mean, for rare disease patients, innovation is a must. I mean, most of the rare disease conditions don't have any option. And many of the treatments that exist are not curative. So there is a huge area of unmet needs. And on the other side, there is a huge potential on competitiveness because Europe has been doing, it's true that it has lost ground, that there's a lot that we have to do to catch up with other regions of the world, but Europe has also, as you have already explained here very well, my peer panelists, there's a lot of excellences where we can build. To cite a few and not to repeat what they say, there is also in the rare disease field already infrastructure that exists. Is not complete, is not addressing all the problems, but we have the European reference networks, which are usually cited as, one flagship program where EU cooperation has, given fruits. There is also the Herdera partnership on research. So there is a lot of initiatives. We at Eurordis have also been advocating, apart from the Biotech Act, also on the need to build coherence and address the fragmentation of these existing initiatives. So we see the Biotech Act as one instrument that can really, from the practical point of view, put together and should put together competitiveness as a core objective, but also at the same time addressing the huge unmet needs of rare diseases. Just to say how they can how we can build them together. Actually, rare diseases is a sector in which a lot of innovation has come in partnership with a lot of small, SMEs and biotech, which are usually like smaller, but also a large partnership with the non-profit sector, with academia. So those are areas of excellence, and many times also pushed by patients. Patients leading really the innovation, patients behind organizations that have developed therapies. So there is a huge opportunity here for the EU to invest in this and to make rare diseases, let's say, I wouldn't call it the flagship, but a sector that can really put the EU again to compete, not only with China and the US, to compete and collaborate, if I may say, because also rare disease patients need collaboration. Many of the diseases also need, data from other parts of the world. So it's not only about competitiveness or competition against, but it's also about, building competitiveness and still bringing all the patients and the cures for them.
Thanks so much. Shane, I would like to turn to you because the subtitle of the European Commission's Life Science Strategy is making Europe the most attractive place for innovation by 2030, which is basically in 3 years' time. From an industry perspective, is the EU doing enough, taking into account what we just heard about the Biotech Act and other instruments? Is the EU doing enough to indeed ensure that Europe is an innovative place and an attractive place for the life science industry?
Thank you, and still good morning, everybody. So I'm General Manager of Takeda, which is a Japanese biopharma company. I'm also head of the Irish Trade Association, IFA, representing about 45 of, I guess, the research-based pharmaceutical organizations. So from a Takeda perspective and from an Ireland industry perspective, we have a lot of crossover in terms of our view on this. I want to echo the panel's comments, and it's come through the morning as well. And I thought the sessions earlier on were excellent, that there is an absolute realization that we are in a race and that we maybe aren't doing as well as we can. And the evidence is very, very clear. Sean spoke about the drift of investment in terms of R&D, the impact that has in terms of clinical trials, in terms of confidence, and that's very, very clear. And in Ireland and across the EU, to reiterate, we do have the expertise, we have the academic centres, we have the physicians, we have the networks. We're building our digital health and electronic health data space capabilities. So it's a really good time, especially with, I guess, the challenges that we had in the last couple of years as regards tariffs and all of that. So it's a really good time. So from a sector perspective, we think the intent is absolutely spot on. We do have views, I guess, on some of the legislation in terms of where it maybe could be enhanced when we get into the debate. But maybe just to pick on one thing, because we've all mentioned clinical trials, and just for folks in the audience who are not part of the sector, I mean, clinical trials are important for a number of different reasons. From a fundamental perspective, they provide access to patients at a very early stage when they wouldn't usually have access to a particular treatment. Very important in rare disease and rare oncology, especially when time is important. It gives physicians very early experience of treatments. It gives the kind of healthcare ecosystem experience. It makes it easier then for the treatment to be reimbursed when the time comes and adopted correctly. And it builds an expertise, so it's a fundamental building block to having a functional and good research-based environment. So it's really, really fundamental, but there's a win for everybody. There's a win for patients, there's a win for physicians, there's a win for the ecosystem, and there's a win for industry. So I really like the fact that everyone is indexing the importance of clinical trials. So that's just to come back on that one. There are really positive elements in the Biotech Act to kind of call out high level. One is a specific focus on IP and SPC protection. We think that's really important to incentivize what usually are high risk and big bet activities by our sector. There are very few sectors who make upfront investments like the pharma sector do, with a very with huge uncertainty in terms of the outcome. So any further incentives would be useful. I think I'd encourage, when the debate happens, and I think Ireland will be central to the Biotech Act, that we look very closely at those mechanisms to ensure we're getting the maximum for them. Even last week, there was a really good publication by Copenhagen Economics, and they looked specifically at the SPC extension and had really good ideas in terms of how to maximize a good intention to bring much greater return, both from an economic perspective, but also a citizen health perspective. And just one final point, I guess. I've grown up in the life sciences sector in Ireland, and we have seen, I guess, the importance, the connection between competitiveness and health. And the sector has been super positive for Ireland's economic health, but it's also been super positive for the health of our citizens, both at home and across Europe. So it's very encouraging to see both elements being part of the one conversation.
Well, that's exactly where I wanted to turn to, because, Bridin, let me turn to you, because speaking about ecosystems, when you look at the life science sector, the pharmaceutical sector, we have seen with other sectors like the steel and solar industry that Europe already lost the race, and that also a lot of jobs have been disappearing to other parts of the world. Whereas, and I think that really matches what you just said, Shane, in Ireland, we actually see what it means if you have a strong ecosystem in terms of the jobs and the skills. So from your perspective, and speaking about the role of local and regional authorities, what is your take on this?
Yeah, thank you very much. I come at this from two perspectives. I'm a local councillor in County Wexford in Ireland, but I also sit on the Committee of Regions here in Europe. If we're to look at it from a local perspective, in my own municipal district, we have Integer, which is the biggest employer in County Wexford. It's not biotech, but it's medical technology. And we have people travel from all over the country to work in Integer. And I know we spoke earlier that there's a huge biotech employer in Carlow that many people from Wexford travel to. What's really important is that we are looking at competitiveness. We have to look at regions all across Europe. They cannot be ignored, because they are the people, or the regions are the ones that will create the environment by which we will attract investment and we will attract companies to come in. So in Wexford, we have extremely good infrastructure, and that has helped us, and we have the skill set. So we have been able to keep people in our region to work in that area. There are, of course, challenges. And housing being one of the biggest challenges. I recently spoke with the CEO of Integer, and he recognised and identified housing for his employers as being the biggest barrier to employment. So that is something, and I know it is something that is reflected across Europe. It's not unique to Ireland. Housing is something that we need to get a grapple on across all industries if we are to attract the skill set that we need. And from a Committee of Regions perspective, I sit on the NAT Commission, and health falls under the NAT Commission. And I suppose strengthening our life sciences sector is at the forefront of conversations at the minute in NAT. And I think that can only serve us well. That can only benefit the industry across Europe. I'm delighted, I suppose, under, as Sean mentioned, our presidency in Ireland, that competitiveness is at the forefront. And I know that our Minister for Health in Ireland is hugely invested in the biotech industry. So for me, we have to look at it from a regional perspective, and how do we invest in our regions to ensure that we keep the skill set in those areas and we attract, whether it be the multinational companies to come in, the multinational biotech companies, or the domestic companies. And I know from speaking, we had I'm not going to call it a party last night to celebrate the Irish presidency, but we had a number of companies from Ireland present at it. And I spoke to 2 professionals from the biotech industry. And they are investing in graduates. So the gap they see is that we have the graduates, we have a lot of our technological universities training and providing the skill set, but we're losing them immediately upon graduation. They are leaving for America or China. So they're starting to invest in domestic biotech companies. So what can we do to keep these people in Ireland? And that reflects across Europe as well.
Thank you so much, and I think that's a very good segue into a deeper look into Ireland and its life sciences sector. But let me turn to you, because I'm sure that there's any questions perhaps at this stage, or are there any reflections that you want to share? Yes, I see a hand there, and I guess that we can come up with a mic, please. Could someone... Because I see a second hand, so great.
Yeah.
So over there, I think here to the left,
the
there's
middle.
2 hands. And if you could just briefly state your name and your affiliation, that would be helpful.
Hi, yeah, I'm Zoe Parker, and I'm a consultant at Parker & Associates. And so I just had a question for you, Shane, coming from Takeda. So as we all know, there's been a lot of discussion on EU preferences, and the IAA has been a massive step forward for how Europe is seen as an autonomous industry. How do you see this coming from a Japanese-based company? And what is the worry of industries in terms of what are the limits for European manufacturing, and when are we seen as a European contributor to Europe's economy in the pharma world?
Let's also perhaps, before you end, because I'm conscious that there's another question over there, so just close to the window. I think the mic is coming your way.
Surikas Yanov, Harvard Alumni Organization. Maybe I should have asked questions previous panel, but I didn't get a chance to. So I wonder, what is Irish presidency take on the perspectives on enlargement, particularly with regards to Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that is probably a question that can be addressed to a different panel, because the scope is different from the panel we're currently discussing, but thanks a lot for that question. So European preference, that's a very important question to address indeed.
Yeah, so just on thanks for the question. Takeda, a global organization, yes, headquartered in Japan, but truly kind of global, multinational, really significant presence in Europe from a manufacturing perspective. And they're a good example, I guess, of most major multinationals. We have 4 sites in Ireland. We've been in Ireland almost 30 years. We have 50 years of heritage now in Belgium with the plant in Les Scenes, and all across Europe. So Europe and Ireland is and has been regarded as obviously a really reliable place for manufacturing, super regulation, geopolitically very, very stable. And take an Irish example, because I know the numbers. Ireland's the biggest exporter of pharmaceutical products in Europe to the US, for example. Takeda's a big component of that. And there's a responsibility with that in terms of how do we safeguard, but then there's a huge opportunity in terms of where does that go with the next stages of manufacturing. So from a Takeda perspective, we've always seen the value of Europe. Europe has always been a very strong place in terms of manufacturing investment. I don't see that's going to change given the level of expertise and how you want to distribute supply chain across the globe. I go back to the R&D piece, because the R&D bit is where potentially the bigger concern is, and maybe the bigger opportunity in terms of the proposed legislation in terms of improving competitiveness on that front. However, none of us can take the manufacturing element for granted. And just to give you an Irish statistic, because it's incredible, we have over 100,000 people working in the pharma and biopharma sector in Ireland, and if you add in med tech, it's close to 200. So you're getting up to close to 4% of the total population working in life sciences. So that's incredible. It's a huge vote of confidence in both Europe and Ireland. So I guess we're acutely aware of anything that can be done from a legislative perspective to make life easier, to incentivize future investment, and to, I guess, safeguard and defend what we have. I think it's a very interesting point about, if I can come back to your point about talent flow out of the country. Ireland's been a huge net importer of talent to keep, I guess, our sector buoyant and functional. The bulk of our universities and technical universities specifically design many of their courses to tailor for our sector. It would be a big challenge if that talent was flowing out of Ireland and out of Europe, because that's not necessarily what it was designed for. But certainly, look, from a Takeda perspective, Europe is super important. We've been quite vocal on that, but as have many of our peer organizations.
Thank you so much for that. And MEP Kelly, I would like to turn to you, because we discussed the importance of the nexus between industrial policies and health and pharmaceutical policies. And recently there was a letter from 3 Irish ministers, I believe, to the Irish presidency, with a call for establishing a pharmaceutical task force, especially to address the nexus between the different policy angles. So from a parliament perspective, how would you work on ensuring that this call becomes a reality?
Yeah, I think anything that helps to bring synergies together is welcome, and I think that could be done quite easily, because there's no point in working in silos, which is one of the problems we do have in Europe. And I think by combining views, then they can be taken on board, be it at Parliament level when we're discussing various proposals as they go through Parliament, or other ways with the Commission. Because I do think that we have a short window of opportunity. We're nearly halfway through this mandate now. The final year will be basically irrelevant, because everyone will be concentrating on the next elections in 2029. So basically we have a maximum of 2 years to get things done. So the more we concentrate our minds, the more we engage with experts, then that's the way to do it. And obviously task forces with expertise have a huge role to play there. The other point I would make, and it comes back to the point about enlargement, I think Montenegro will probably come in or be given the go-ahead by the end of this year. Albania are very close, and the others will probably close some chapters. Ireland's in favour of that. But it brings the point that we haven't capitalised on enough. They want to come into Europe for a reason. Why do all the refugees want to come to Europe? They aren't queuing up to go to China, to Russia or the US. So if we get our strategy right, we become a very attractive place to live, quality of life, peace, etc. But we've got to get rid of the barriers which we've created. And some of those are being addressed, as I said, in the Biotech Act, like extending patent protection from 5 to 6 years. Victoria referenced the EIB investment, building on the InvestEU, starting back many years ago with the Juncker Fund, which got us out of the recession. Then things like pilot projects, dedicated strategic projects, a bit like we have in energy, PCIs, all those things. But also we have to reduce, for instance, the approvals of clinical trials. In Europe, it takes 113 days. In China and the US, 60 days. These are all self-imposed matters which we can address and will address. And by getting people together who will identify them, the MEPs and the rapporteurs in particular take them on board, getting the amendments through and done, then I think we'll be in a great place to progress this into the future.
Well, thank you so much. And I think, Shane, it made me think of what you said when we engaged in the conversation before this panel, because this clearly links to the Transparency Directive, where, again, the time in Europe is considerable when it comes to bringing medicines to the market. And you have been involved in recent negotiations between the Irish government and the Irish industry about trying to speed us up. So also bringing it back to what we can learn from countries like Ireland, what was the nature of the conversations, and is this something that perhaps at EU level we can learn from?
Yeah, thank you. So we recently concluded our framework agreement with the Irish state in terms of, I guess, the next up until 2029 in terms of how we will fund and access new innovative treatments. So a key thing in Ireland and also, I guess, across Europe is that we're seeing timelines extend for access to new innovative treatments, and it's more pronounced in rare disease, which Rosa will know. So this was a really key focus of the current dialogue and agreement with the state, and a very clear anchor to the Transparency Directive, which really means that we need to have decisions on reimbursement within 180 days. So I think the patient organizations, the healthcare ecosystem industry were all very satisfied with the current commitment that we now have, so that over the course of the next 3 years that we will see a reduction in time to decision down to 180 days.
Which is still a lot, right, if you compare it to the US and China?
Which is still, it's a very good point, but we're in a situation right now where it can take you on average between 600 and 700 days, maybe 1,000 days for a rare disease treatment. So that would be a very, very significant change. And it's also a really good example, I feel, and we feel, a really good example for other European countries, that that the Transparency Directive, the 180 days, is a really good target in terms of trying to improve access to innovative medicines. Because we need to be very, very consistent. We're talking about trying to attract more investment, grow the ecosystem. We also then need to be keen on adopting those innovations. And that hasn't been necessarily the case over the last number of years. So I think what we have in Ireland right now is a really positive signal and a very useful mechanism for other states to follow if they wish to speed up access to innovative treatments.
And Rosa, speaking about ecosystems, that made me think of the role of the European Reference Network. What is the role of the Reference Network also related to the time it takes to access and speeding up innovation for patients?
Well, thank you. I mean, I think I would like to refer to that because it's. I think maybe we can broaden the answer, because obviously there's a lot that the EU can do, and I think it can do it also via the Biotech Act, building upon the existing infrastructure like European Reference Network, also other centers of excellence, because there are a few, the European Reference Networks don't necessarily cover every country or every disease, so we have to be careful also to build upon that existing infrastructure. So that's part of it, but we can ask, we have to also be very careful in the sense that there's a lot more that the reference networks can do, for instance, building up upon the registry and the data, and taking that excellence, and they can also connect the patients and help the patients up to a certain extent. But for instance, just let me bring it. Yesterday at the European Parliament, we were talking actually with a lot of coordinators from the ERNs. And for patients, it really matters that you have the right medicine at the right time in the right place. So we cannot also ask the ERNs, which are still to be really embedded in the healthcare systems, in the national healthcare systems, to solve every hurdle. So there's a lot that the healthcare authorities need to solve also. I think one of you mentioned, I don't remember now, the cross-border, the issues with cross-border, and we were referring to that yesterday again. So there is a framework with a directive and a regulation which are still there. So there is a lot of hurdles, and some of them can be addressed by the Biotech Act, access to capital, creating the right enabling ecosystem, including the ERNs, with data sharing, with excellence, and with building that excellence into treatments. They can also be more involved in clinical trials. But then you go into the regulatory hurdles. They can do a little bit, but then we go into also the HTA, and there needs to be a lot. Eurordis have been pushing for early dialogue to make sure that both processes do not delay, start very early dialogue, so to build upon to be ready, really, so that those treatments, when they are developed, they are also ready. For you, is for the industry is uptake of the innovation, or getting the value for innovation. For the patients, is really their only hope. And with rare diseases, there are a lot very debilitating. It really matters that you get that treatment. 1 month later can be too late, because you can have a child who could have severe damage and will not be able to fully benefit from that treatment. So it matters a lot. So I'm just saying, I think there's a lot that can be done with the existing infrastructure, including the ERNs and the centers of excellence, but there are a lot of issues that also happened after, where we need the willingness of the member states. And it's really welcome to hear that Ireland has taken this step also in diminishing the timelines for following the Transparency Directive. There is even more, because after the pricing and reimbursement, there are still hurdles. So there are prior authorization, maybe you don't get the treatment, it's not available in your own member state, and the patient has to go to another center, especially with advanced therapy. So yeah, let's ask from the ERNs and let's push for them to do a lot, but they cannot solve every little issue, so let's be careful that everyone else is involved as well.
But it comes back to also what probably the ministers were calling for, the importance of also public-private collaboration and ensuring that all the relevant stakeholders are working together in a life science context. So, Vittoria, I'm sure that you're not going to comment on whether the Commission is going to take into account this idea, but indeed the need to build on centers of excellence like Ireland and to ensure that, let's say, academic ideas are being translated into real patient innovation and access to that innovation. Your take from the Commission perspective, and again, taking a broader perspective than just the Biotech Act, which is a tool in that discussion.
Yep. Exactly. The Biotech Act is indeed one of the tools, and it will be actually, I think, inefficient to think that that legislation alone can tackle all these issues. That's why it's part of a constellation. We have spoken a lot about the European reference networks, which of course are supported by the European Commission, because they are a huge tool, but if you look at the reality of the ground of the networks, they are really in very different situations. There are some that have very coherent registry, some that include less data, and so it's important to have the member states working together to embed them in the healthcare system. It's important to have the European health data space taking into account of common data sets so that the ERN can talk together. And that's outside the Biotech Act, but it works with the Biotech Act. And that's just 2 examples. In HTA, we have the joint clinical assessment started already for ATMPs and oncology, but many of these are OMP indications. So we have already tackling rare. And there is really a need for coherence between all these aspects. When it comes to partnership, that's very well acknowledged in the proposal of the Biotech Act, and of course we are now discussing with Parliament and Council, and I'm sure it will be enriched, but it's already there. In fact, I liked very much your initial point about the ingenuity of the patient community. I have example that we saw in Ghent of innovators that have rare diseases, and that's why they brought this innovation to the market in a very, very super rare indication called Charcot-Marie-Tooth. Ingenuity and needs, they go hand in hand. So the innovators are not need to be absolutely only a commercial sponsor. They can be non-for-profit sponsor, and they can work together in the idea that we have, for example, for the strategic projects and many other outside the Biotech Act. So I think it's a constellation of things that should definitely work together, and the notion and the sentiment, I think the Commission is aligned with that, of course.
Well, thank you so much. We're approaching the end, so Braden, I would like to end with you. I think that's quite good, actually, to end with the Irish perspective. And I think my short question for you would be, after 6 months, in December this year, what would a successful Irish presidency look like for you from a regional, from a local perspective?
Oh gosh, that's a lovely question to end on. I think it's an exciting time in Europe. I really do. I was appointed to the Committee of Regions only in July, so I'm still a newbie as such. But I think it is an exciting time in Europe, and I certainly think it's an exciting time to take on the presidency. we are very progressive in Ireland, and I would like to see how we have progressed being reflected across Europe. I suppose one of the big challenges, and I represent a very rural community, access is a huge challenge, access to services and access to healthcare. We're seeing, and I guess I'll go back to general healthcare in terms of GP access, general practitioner access, for example, is quite problematic. And we have a two-tiered system, so there's public and private, and depending on which one you are, access is extremely problematic. And so I'd like those to be the issues that we start to look at and we start to address. No different to the biotech industry, how do we attract general practitioners into rural communities? You know, it is all in the same basket, really. And I think that's what I would like to see is not being afraid to look at what the challenges are and putting practical solutions in place to address them. As I said, it's a really exciting time. Yesterday was fantastic to take to the floor in the Parliament and speak on behalf of Ireland, and you know, and we have incredible industry in Ireland, and I think it's time we saw that reflected across Europe.
Well, thank you so much. And I think with that, we all wish the Irish presidency every luck for the 6 months to come. So please join me in thanking this panel and the great contributions for your contribution.
Well done, guys.
Gloria. Rosa, good.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And while you indeed go back to your seats, I would like to ask you to stay because we have a really interesting closing session. And while our speakers look for their